Hello and welcome to WePC Benchmarks. My name is Seb and today I'm taking a look at the Razer Blade 14. The laptop comes equipped with a Ryzen 9 5900HX, an RTX 3080 laptop GPU, as well as 16GB of 3200MHz RAM, a 1TB SSD, and a 1440p 165Hz display. It's quite a powerful machine with a very good screen, and I tested it in 8 games, each at 4040p, but ranging at low, medium and high settings. The laptop uses a combination of both GPU and CPU graphics, so at times there seems to be higher CPU utilization, and not 100% GPU utilization, even with performance mode enabled throughout. So there were some weird results, but mostly just seemed lower than they could be. So let's take a look at how it performed. We start off with CSGO. And at low we get an average of 151 FPS, with a 1% of 86 and a 0.1% of 66. Increasing the settings to medium, and we get an average of 148 FPS with a 1% of 78 and a 0.1% of 14. And then at high, we get an average of 138 FPS with a 1% of 60 and a 0.1% of 25. The next game up is Doom Eternal, and it's the first opportunity to check how much ray tracing affects the performance. But we start with it off, and at low we get an average of 88 FPS with a 1% of 42 and a 0.1% of 40. Moving up to medium, and we get an average of 80 FPS with a 1% of 40 and a 0.1% of 38. Then at Ultra Nightmare, we get an average of 73 FPS with a 1% of 36 and a 0.1% of 33. Then turning on ray tracing and turning settings down back to low, we get an average of 65 FPS with a 1% of 37 and a 0.1% of 36. Up to medium, and the laptop averages 61 FPS with a 1% of 36 and a 0.1% of 31. And moving up to Ultra Nightmare, it gets an average of 55 FPS with a 28 1% and a 26 0.1%. Moving on to Far Cry 5, and at low settings the game averages at 76 FPS with a 1% of 49 and a 0.1% of 42. And then at medium, the game averages at 77 FPS with a 1% of 44 and a 0.1% of 36. So pretty similar to low, which is likely caused by the lower utilization of the GPU, but I was unable to fix that. So then at high, the game averages to 49 FPS with a 1% of 33 and a 0.1% of 22. Moving on to Fortnite, and when at low, it averages to 123 FPS with a 1% of 77 and a 0.1% of 18. Then moving up to medium, we get an average of 110 FPS with a 47 1% and a 26 0.1%. And then at high, we get an average of 66, 1% of 43, and a 0.1% of 19. Next up is Rainbow Six Siege, which at low averages at 116 FPS, with a 1% of 87, and a 0.1% of 67. Moving up to a medium, and the game averages at 108 FPS, with a 1% of 85, and a 0.1% of 66. And then at high settings, it averages to 105 FPS, and a 1% of 80, and a 0.1% of 62. The next game is Resident Evil Village, and at low settings it averages to 99 FPS with a 1% of 67 and a 0.1% of 59. On medium settings, the game averages at 90 FPS with a 1% of 61 and a 0.1% of 37. And then at high, it averages to 85 FPS with a 1% of 40 and a 0.1% of 37. And then I also tested the game with ray tracing, and at low it averages 83 FPS with a 1% of 52 and a 0.1% of 36. Moving up to medium, it averages to 62 FPS with a 1% of 34 and a 0.1% of 33. Then at high, we get an average of 59 FPS with a 1% of 32 and a 0.1% of 28. Next up is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and at low settings it averages to 97 FPS with a 1% of 62 and a 0.1% of 50. And increasing the settings to medium, we get an average of 72 FPS with a 1% of 36 and a 0.1% of 35. And then at high, it averages to 62 FPS with a 1% of 32 and a 0.1% of 31. Then I also tested the game with ray tracing, and at low it averages to 44 FPS with a 1% of 26 and a 0.1% of 26. Moving them up to medium, and the game averages to 39 FPS with a 1% of 27 and a 0.1% of 26. Then with high settings, the game averages to 38 FPS with a 1% of 27 and a 0.1% of 27 also. And lastly, we have Warzone, and on low settings, the game averages to 84 FPS, with a 1% of 44 and a 0.1% of 30. Then with medium settings, the game averages to 73 FPS, with a 1% of 35 and a 0.1% of 29. And then at max settings, the game averages 69 FPS, with a 1% of 36 and a 0.1% of 34. So there you have it, the Razer Blade 14, benchmarked on 8 games, and as you can see, it's a competent machine. It's a good option for both gaming and other work, as with 8 cores and a 3.3 GHz base clock, it's definitely a good option for other work that can handle any task you might throw at it. So, thank you for watching, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.